Hey guys, tonight we're exploring the strange and often unbelievable rules that limited the lives of American women in the 1960 Sekunde. And before we begin, please consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoy relaxing history stories. Imagine waking up in America during the early 1960s. The streets are full of shiny new cars. Televisions glow in living rooms across the nation. And the country proudly presents itself as a land of freedom and opportunity. Yet for millions of women, every day, life is shaped by rules that quietly remind them they are not considered equal to men. A young woman finishing college may dream of becoming a lawyer, doctor, or business executive, but many doors remain firmly closed. Employers openly advertise jobs for men only, while women are expected to choose from a small list of acceptable careers, such as teaching, nursing, or secretarial work. Nobody considers this unusual. In fact, many people believe it is simply the natural order of society. A woman applying for a bank account may discover that financial independence is not as simple as walking into a bank and signing paperwork. Many financial institutions prefer dealing with husbands rather than wives, assuming that men should control family finances. Even women who earn their own salaries often find themselves treated as if they are temporary workers merely waiting for marriage. Television programs, magazines, and advertisements constantly repeat the same message. The ideal woman is cheerful, attractive, obedient, and devoted to her home. She is expected to support her husband's ambitions while placing her own dreams somewhere in the background. If she questions these expectations, she risks being labelled difficult or unfeminine. Marriage itself carries many hidden restrictions. In some woke places, women quietly understand that getting married could damage their careers. Certain employers believe married women should stay home and focus on family responsibilities. Pregnancy can be an even greater problem. A woman who becomes pregnant may suddenly lose her job regardless of her skills or experience. There are few legal protections to stop employers from making such decisions. Universities also reflect these attitudes. While more women attend college than in previous generations, many schools place limits on female students or discourage them from entering prestigious programs. Guidance counselors often steer young women toward marriage rather than professional achievement. The message is subtle but powerful. Society expects women to support the future, not lead it. Yet beneath the surface, change is beginning to stir. Some women start asking difficult questions. Why should their opportunities depend on their gender? Why should laws, businesses, and institutions treat them differently? These questions spread through classrooms, workplaces, and communities. A movement is slowly forming, though few people yet realize how dramatically it will transform American society. As the decade unfolds, the quiet frustrations of millions of women will grow into one of the most important social movements in modern history. By the middle of the 1960 Sekunde, many women begin noticing that the promises of modern America do not always match reality. They can see new technologies arriving in homes, astronauts preparing for space missions, and politicians speaking proudly about progress. Yet, when women seek the same opportunities as men, they often encounter invisible barriers that seem impossible to overcome. A woman may perform the same. Work as a male colleague while receiving a smaller paycheck. Everyone knows it happens. But few people in positions of power seem interested in changing it. In offices across the country, women type reports, organise schedules, and manage important responsibilities. However, promotions usually go to men. Managers frequently assume that female employees are less committed to their careers because they might marry or have children. The result is a frustrating cycle. Women are denied opportunities because they are not seen as leaders. And they are not seen as leaders because they are denied opportunities. Credit presents another challenge. Today, applying for a credit card may seem routine. But in the 1960s, many women struggled to establish financial independence. Banks and lenders often view single women as risky customers regardless of their income or savings. Even successful professionals can find themselves treated as dependents, rather than adults capable of managing their own finances. For divorced and widowed women, these obstacles can be especially difficult. Everyday life contains countless reminders of these unequal expectations. Newspapers frequently advertise jobs separately for men and women. Men are offered positions with authority, higher salaries, and opportunities for advancement. Women are offered roles focused on support and service. Few people openly question this arrangement because it has existed for so long that it feels normal. Yet attitudes are slowly beginning to shift. Books, articles, and public discussions encourage women to examine their lives in a new way. Some begin realizing that their personal frustrations are not isolated experiences. Millions of others share the same concerns. A woman who once believed she alone felt dissatisfied suddenly discovers that countless others feel exactly the same. This realization creates a powerful sense of unity. Organizations dedicated to women's rights start attracting supporters from different backgrounds. Teachers, office workers, students, nurses, and homemakers all contribute their voices. They do not agree on every issue, but they share a common belief that women deserve equal treatment under the law and in society. Their efforts are not always welcomed. Critics accuse them of threatening traditional values and family life. Some newspapers portray activists as radicals seeking to destroy social stability. Nevertheless, the movement continues growing. The more women discuss their experiences, the harder it becomes for society to ignore them. What began as quiet conversations among friends is gradually becoming a national debate, one that will soon challenge long-standing assumptions about gender, work, marriage, and freedom throughout the United States. As the movement gains strength, lawmakers and government officials can no longer pretend that these concerns do not exist. Across the country, women begin sharing stories that sound remarkably similar. One woman describes losing a promotion despite years of experience. Another explains how she was dismissed from a job after becoming pregnant. Others speak about financial institutions refusing to treat them as independent adults. These stories reveal that the problem is not individual failure, but a system that consistently favours men. In 1963, an important step forward arrives with the Equal Pay Act, a law designed to reduce wage discrimination between men and women. Many celebrate the change, but reality proves more complicated. Some employers simply find new ways to justify paying women less. The law represents progress, yet true equality remains far away. The following year brings another significant development. The Civil Rights Act includes provisions that prohibit employment discrimination based on sex. Few people initially realise how important this section will become. Over time, it provides women with a powerful legal tool to challenge unfair treatment in the workplace. Still, changing laws is easier than changing attitudes. Many managers, politicians, and community leaders continue believing that men should naturally occupy positions of authority. Women entering traditionally male professions often face skepticism and hostility. Some are told directly that they do not belong. Others encounter subtle forms of discrimination that are difficult to prove but impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the conversation spreads beyond workplaces and government offices. Women began questioning expectations surrounding marriage, family roles, and personal freedom. For generations, society has taught that a woman's highest purpose is caring for her husband and children. While many women value family life, they increasingly reject the idea that it should be their only option. The growing debate creates tension throughout the nation. Supporters argue that equality benefits everyone by allowing talent and ambition to flourish regardless of gender. Opponents fear that traditional social structures are being challenged too rapidly. Yet, despite criticism and resistance, the momentum continues building. By the late 1960s, it becomes clear that America is entering a period of profound social change. The rules that once seemed permanent are beginning to crack, and millions of women are preparing to demand far more than small reforms. They are demanding a future in which their opportunities are determined, not by their gender, but by their abilities, ambitions, and choices. The struggle for equality is not limited to offices and courtrooms. It also reaches into homes, schools, and everyday conversations. Mothers begin raising daughters with different expectations than previous generations. Instead of assuming their daughters will simply become wives and homemakers, many start encouraging them to pursue education and careers. For young girls growing up during this period, the future slowly begins to look different from the one their mothers experienced. Television and popular culture, however, often send mixed messages. On one hand, advertisements continue presenting the image of the perfect housewife, smiling beside a washing machine or serving dinner to her family. On the other hand, newspapers increasingly report on women breaking barriers in business, politics, science, and education. These competing visions create uncertainty about what the role of women should be in modern America. Universities become important centres of discussion. Female students challenge rules that have existed for decades. They question why leadership positions are usually held by men and why certain opportunities remain limited. Student groups organise meetings, publish articles, and hold debates about equality. Ideas that once seemed radical begin attracting mainstream attention. Some men support these changes, believing that fairness and opportunity should apply to everyone. Others feel threatened, worrying that shifting gender roles might weaken traditions they have always known. Family dinners, workplaces, and community gatherings become places where these arguments are discussed. The nation is experiencing not just legal change, but cultural change as well. One of the most important developments is the growing realization that discrimination often appears. In some ways, a woman may not be openly told she cannot succeed, yet she may constantly face assumptions that discourage her ambitions. These invisible barriers can be just as powerful as official restrictions. Recognizing them becomes an essential part of the movement for equality. By the end of the decade, many women feel a sense of possibility that would have seemed unrealistic only a few years earlier. Challenges remain everywhere, but progress is becoming visible. New opportunities are opening. Old assumptions are being questioned. And millions of Americans are beginning to rethink what equality truly means. The changes of the 1960s are laying the foundation for battles and victories that will continue into the decades ahead, transforming the lives of future generations in ways that few people can yet imagine. As the 1970s approach, the energy created during the previous decade begins, producing results that would have seemed impossible not long before. Women who once felt isolated now belong to organizations with thousands of members. Their voices are becoming louder, more organized, and increasingly difficult for politicians to ignore. Newspapers regularly publish stories about equality, discrimination, and women's rights. What was once considered a niche issue has become part of a national conversation. Many employers slowly start adjusting their policies. Some businesses discover that talented women can perform leadership roles just as effectively as men. Female managers, lawyers, professors, and journalists become more visible. Their success challenges old stereotypes that claimed women lacked the ability or temperament for positions of authority. Every woman who succeeds in one of these fields makes it easier for others to follow. At the same time, progress remains uneven. In many communities, traditional expectations continue to dominate daily life. Women who pursue ambitious careers are sometimes criticized for neglecting family responsibilities. Others face pressure to choose between professional success and personal relationships. Society is changing, but not everyone welcomes the transformation. One of the movement's greatest strengths is persistence. Activists understand that a few new laws cannot instantly erase generations of unequal treatment. They continue collecting evidence, organizing events, and educating the public. They encourage women to understand their legal rights and challenge unfair practices whenever they encounter them. Small victories accumulate over time, creating momentum that pushes the movement forward. The younger generation plays an especially important role. Girls growing up in the late 1960s and early 1970s witness women demanding opportunities their mothers were often denied. They see female students entering competitive universities, women running for public office, and professionals refusing to accept discriminatory treatment. These examples reshape expectations about what is possible. For many Americans, the changes can feel surprising because they happen gradually. No single day marks the end of the old system. Instead, attitudes shift little by little. A policy changes here, a barrier falls there, and another opportunity opens somewhere else. Looking back years later, people realize that society has been transformed. Yet the story is not simply about laws or politics. It is also about millions of ordinary women making everyday decisions. Some choose to continue traditional lifestyles. Others pursue careers. Many combine both family and professional ambitions. Increasingly, the goal becomes freedom of choice rather than forcing everyone into the same role. By the early 1970s, it is clear that the America of the future will be different from the America of the past. The assumptions that once limited women's opportunities are being challenged from every direction, and a new chapter in the nation's history is only beginning to unfold. While many of the most visible battles take place in courts, workplaces, and government offices, the true impact of these changes is often felt inside ordinary homes. Families begin having conversations that would have been unusual only a decade earlier. Parents discuss college, plans for their daughters with the same seriousness they once reserved for their sons. Young women start imagining futures that include careers, travel, leadership, and independence. The range of possibilities slowly expands. For some women, these changes bring excitement and hope. For others, they create uncertainty. Many had been raised to believe that happiness could only be found through marriage and domestic life. Now they are hearing new messages about personal freedom and self-determination. Navigating these competing expectations is not always easy. Some women embrace the new opportunities immediately, while others move more cautiously, trying to balance tradition with change. The economy also plays a role in transforming society. As living costs rise, more families rely on two incomes. Women enter the workforce in increasing numbers, not only because they want careers, but because many households need additional financial support. Employers gradually adapt to this reality. Businesses that once assumed women would leave after marriage discover that many intend to build long-term careers. Popular culture begins reflecting these shifts. Books written by women reach large audiences. Television programs introduce more independent female characters. Magazines start discussing topics that were previously ignored. Although stereotypes remain common, the image of what a woman can be is becoming broader than ever before. Still, resistance remains strong in many places. Some people insist that society is changing too quickly. They argue that traditional gender roles should remain untouched. Debates become increasingly passionate because both sides believe they are protecting important values. Yet despite disagreements, the direction of change becomes difficult to stop. Too many women have experienced their limitations of the old system and are unwilling to return to it. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this period is how quickly attitudes can evolve once people begin questioning long-held assumptions. Ideas that seemed unquestionable in the early 1960 Sekunde no longer appear so certain by the decades and younger generations. grow up seeing a world that is already different from the one their parents knew. The transformation is far from complete, but the foundation has been laid. Millions of women have discovered that they are not alone in their frustrations, hopes, and ambitions. They have learned that social rules can change and that progress often begins when ordinary people refuse to accept unfair limitations. The movement that started with quiet questions has become a force that will continue shaping American society for decades to come. By the time the 1970s fully arrive, many of the restrictions that once seemed normal are being challenged in ways few Americans could have imagined a generation earlier. Women continue entering professions that had long been dominated by men. Law schools, medical schools, and business programs begin seeing growing numbers of female students. Each success story serves as proof that ability is not determined by gender. The old assumptions do not disappear overnight, but they become harder and harder to defend. In many workplaces, women who once quietly accepted discrimination begin speaking up. Some file complaints against employers. Others organize with co-workers to demand fair treatment. These actions require courage, because challenging authority can place careers at risk. Yet many decide that remaining silent would guarantee that nothing changes. Their determination gradually reshapes workplace culture across the country. The effects are felt beyond employment. Women become more involved in politics, community organizations, and public life. They run for local offices, join advocacy groups, and participate in debates about the future of the nation. As more female voices enter public discussions, issues that were once ignored receive greater attention. Topics such as childcare, workplace equality, education, and healthcare become part of mainstream political conversations. For older women, these changes can be especially meaningful. Some spent decades living under rules they never questioned because they believed no alternative existed. Watching younger generations gain opportunities they never had brings both pride and reflection. They realize that history is changing before their eyes. At the same time, the movement reminds Americans of an important truth. Rights that seem ordinary today were often won through years of persistence. Many freedoms are easy to take for granted once they become established. Future generations may find it difficult to imagine a time when women faced so many legal and social barriers in everyday life. Yet that world existed within living memory. As the years pass, historians will look back on the 1960s as a turning point. It was a decade when millions of women began questioning expectations that had shaped society for generations. Some changes happened quickly, while others took decades. But the process had begun, and it would continue influencing American life long into the future. The story of women in 1960s. America is therefore not only a story about restrictions. It is also a story about determination, resilience, and gradual progress. It shows how ordinary people can challenge long-standing traditions and reshape the society around them. And as our journey through this remarkable period continues, we will soon discover just how far these changes would reach in the decades that followed. Yet, even as opportunities expanded, many women discovered that changing laws did not automatically change minds. A company might officially promise equal treatment while managers still favoured male, employees for promotions, university might welcome female students while some professors continued believing that women were less suited for demanding professions. The barriers were becoming less visible, but they had not completely disappeared. Throughout the 1970s, women continued pushing for greater equality. They challenged hiring practices, questioned outdated policies, and demanded representation in places where decisions were made. Their efforts slowly produced results. More women entered boardrooms, newsrooms, courtrooms, and government offices. Each new achievement helped normalize the idea that women could succeed in any field they chose. The media also played an important role. Newspapers and television programs increasingly featured stories about successful women who had overcome obstacles. Young girls growing up during this period could now see examples of female doctors, lawyers, athletes, scientists, and political leaders. These role models helped reshape expectations for future generations. Dreams that once seemed unrealistic now felt attainable. At home, family dynamics continued evolving. Husbands and wives began sharing responsibilities in ways that would have seemed unusual in earlier decades. While traditional arrangements remained common, more families started adapting to a world in which both partners worked outside the home. Society was gradually redefining what marriage, parenthood, and partnership could look like. Not every change happened smoothly. Economic difficulties, political disagreements, and cultural conflicts often created tension. Some Americans worried that rapid social changes were weakening familiar traditions. Others argued that equality strengthened society by allowing everyone to contribute their talents. These debates filled newspapers, television broadcasts, and community meetings throughout the decade. Looking back, one of the most remarkable aspects of this transformation is how quickly public attitudes shifted once conversations began. In the early 1960s, many restrictions on women were accepted without question. By the end of the 1970s, those same restrictions were increasingly viewed as unfair or outdated. What had once seemed permanent proved capable of change. The women who lived through this period rarely knew how history would judge their efforts. Most were simply trying to improve their own lives and create better opportunities for those who came after them. Yet together, their actions contributed to one of the most significant social transformations in modern American history. As the decades moved forward, new challenges would emerge and new battles would be fought. Equality remained a work in progress rather than a finished achievement, but the foundations built during the 1960s and 1970s ensured that future generations would inherit a world with far more possibilities than the one that existed before. And for millions of women, that change made all the difference. As the 1980s begin, America is no longer the same country it was 20 years earlier. Many of the rules and expectations that shaped women's lives during the early 1960 Sekunde have weakened or disappeared. Young women entering adulthood often possess freedoms there mothers and grandmothers could only imagine. They can pursue careers manage their own finances, attend prestigious universities, and compete for opportunities that were once reserved almost exclusively for men. Yet history rarely moves in a straight line. Every generation faces new challenges, and progress often arrives with unexpected complications. Some women find that balancing careers and family responsibilities remains difficult. Others discover that equality on paper does not always guarantee equality in practice. The conversation evolves from gaining access to opportunities toward ensuring fair treatment within them. Despite these challenges, the transformation remains extraordinary. Consider how much changed in only a few decades. A young woman in the early 1960s might have been encouraged to limit her ambitions and focus primarily on domestic life. By the 1980s, young women are increasingly told that they can become doctors, attorneys, executives, professors, journalists, or entrepreneurs. The difference is not merely legal. It reflects a profound shift in cultural expectations. Historians often note that major social changes are rarely the result of a single law or a single famous speech. Instead, they emerge from countless small actions taken by ordinary people. A woman who applies for a job despite being told she does not belong. A student who enrolls in a program dominated by men. A worker who challenges unfair treatment. A mother who encourages her daughter to dream bigger than society expects. Individually, these actions may seem small. Together, they reshape history. The story of women in 1960s. America also reveals how quickly accepted norms can change. Ideas that appeared permanent were questioned, debated, and eventually transformed. This serves as a reminder that societies are constantly evolving. Customs that seem normal in one era may appear surprising to future generations. For modern viewers, some of the restrictions faced by women during that period may sound almost unbelievable. Yet they were real experiences for millions of people living ordinary lives. Understanding this, history helps explain how recent many of today's freedoms actually are. They were not simply given, they were earned through persistence, courage, and years of effort from individuals who believed the future could be different. And as we continue our quiet journey through the past, we begin to see that the story is not only about women. It is about how societies change, how assumptions are challenged, and how ordinary people can influence the direction of history in ways they may never fully realize at the time. Looking back from the present day, it can be easy to assume that change was inevitable. But for the women living through the 1960s, nothing felt guaranteed. Many had no way of knowing whether their efforts would succeed or whether society would remain exactly as it had been for generations. Every step forward required patience. Every challenge to an old rule carried risk. Some lost jobs faced criticism from neighbours, or found themselves at odds with family members who believed traditional roles should never change. Yet history often moves because ordinary people refuse to accept limitations placed upon them. Across America, countless women quietly continued pushing boundaries. Some became the first women in their workplaces. Others pursued higher education despite being discouraged. Many simply insisted on being treated with the same respect given to men. Their actions did not always make headlines, but they helped create lasting change. The impact extended beyond women themselves. families adapted to new realities. Employers gained access to talented workers they might previously have overlooked. Schools and universities benefited from a broader range of students. Society gradually learned that opportunity should not depend on gender. While disagreements remained, the idea of equal rights became increasingly difficult to oppose openly. One of the most fascinating aspects of this period is how quickly younger generations adjusted to changes that once seemed revolutionary. Children growing up during the 1970s and 1980s often accepted new opportunities as normal. They could hardly imagine a world where women were routinely denied certain careers or treated as financially dependent, regardless of their abilities. What had once been controversial slowly became part of everyday life. Of course, history never truly ends. New questions emerged as old barriers disappeared. Discussions about workplace equality, leadership, education, and representation continued into future decades. Each generation inherited both the achievements and unfinished work of those who came before. Progress was not a destination but an ongoing process. The story also reminds us that laws alone cannot transform society overnight. Real change occurs when attitudes, expectations, and opportunities evolve together. The legal victories of the era were important, but so were the countless personal decisions made by individuals determined to create better futures for themselves and their families. As evening settles over our historical journey, imagine an American woman standing in 1960 and looking toward the future. She could not see all the changes that were coming. She could not know how dramatically society would transform within her lifetime. But through the actions of millions of women like her, the future slowly took shape. Their persistence altered the course of history, proving that, even long-established traditions can change when enough people believe a better world is possible. By the late 20th century, many of the battles that began in the 1960 Sekunde had become part of American history books. Yet, for the women who lived through those years, these events were not distant history. They were personal experiences remembered through conversations, photographs, letters, and memories of opportunities once denied. Or grandmother could tell her granddaughter about a time when women were expected to follow rules that now seemed almost impossible to imagine. The younger generation often listened with surprise, struggling to believe how different everyday life had once been. This contrast between generations reveals how powerful social change can be. What one generation accepts as normal, another may view as unfair. Throughout history, societies have constantly re-examined old traditions and decided which should remain and which should be left behind. The story of women in 1960s America is one example of this larger pattern. It shows how cultural expectations are not fixed forever but can evolve over time. Many women who participated in the movement never considered themselves activists. They were teachers, office workers, students, nurses, mothers, and neighbours. Some simply wanted equal pay. Others wanted access to education or professional opportunities. Many wanted the freedom to make their own choices without society deciding their future for them. Their goals varied, but together they helped create a broader movement for change. The lessons of this era extend beyond questions of gender. They demonstrate how progress often begins with conversations. Before laws changed, people first had to discuss problems that had long been ignored. Before policies were reformed, individuals had to question assumptions that seemed unquestionable. Change started when people looked at familiar systems and asked whether they were truly fair. For historians, the 1960s remain one of the most fascinating decades in American history because so many transformations occurred at once. Civil rights movements, cultural shifts, political debates, and changing social values all influenced one another. Women's rights became part of a larger national discussion about freedom, equality, and opportunity. These conversations helped shape the modern United States. Today, many freedoms that women enjoy may feel ordinary, but understanding the past reveals how recently some of those freedoms became widely available. History reminds us that progress is often the result of years of effort by people who refuse to accept unnecessary limitations. Their work may not always receive recognition, yet its effects can last for generations. And as our story continues to drift quietly through the decades, we can see that the women of the 1960 Sekunde left behind more than legal reforms. They left behind a legacy of determination and possibility, proving that, even deeply rooted, traditions can change when ordinary people believe that a better future is worth pursuing. Perhaps the most lasting achievement of the women who challenged these restrictions was not a specific law or court decision, but a change in how society viewed possibility itself. Before the 1960s, many girls grew up with a fairly narrow vision of what their future might look like. Certain careers seemed out of reach. Certain ambitions appeared unrealistic. Many opportunities were quietly reserved for men. By questioning these assumptions, women helped expand the boundaries of what future generations could imagine for themselves. In schools across America, young girls increasingly encountered teachers who encouraged them to excel in mathematics, science, literature, and leadership. Universities that had once limited female participation gradually opened more doors. Businesses slowly began recognizing that talent could be found everywhere. These changes did not happen all at once, but their cumulative effect was enormous. The transformation also influenced popular attitudes toward independence. Women were increasingly viewed as individuals capable of making their own financial, educational, and professional decisions. This may seem obvious today, yet it represented a significant shift from earlier decades, when many institutions assumed women required guidance from fathers or husbands. The idea of personal autonomy became more widely accepted as society evolved. At the same time, many women continued valuing family life, marriage, and motherhood. The movement was not simply about replacing one set of expectations with another. For many participants, the goal was choice. A woman should be free to pursue a career, focus on family, or combine both according to her own wishes rather than social pressure. This emphasis on choice became one of the defining principles of the era. Historians often point out that major social changes can feel surprisingly ordinary while they are happening. Most people living through the 1960s still went to work, attended school, prepared meals, paid bills, and cared for their families. Life continued much as it always had. Yet, beneath these everyday routines, attitudes were shifting in ways that would influence future generations. What seemed like small changes at the time eventually reshaped entire institutions. The story of women in 1960s. America, therefore, teaches an important lesson about history. Change is rarely the result of a single dramatic moment. More often, it emerges through countless conversations, decisions, and acts of persistence repeated over many years. Individuals may not realize the significance of their actions, yet together they contribute to transformations far larger than themselves. As we continue moving gently through this chapter of the past, we find ourselves observing a society in transition. Old expectations are fading, new possibilities are appearing, and millions of women are helping redefine what freedom and opportunity can mean. The journey is not finished, but the direction is becoming increasingly clear, and the effects of these changes will continue echoing far into the future. As the years passed, the changes that began in the 1960s became woven into everyday American life. New generations grew up in a world shaped by the efforts of women who had challenged old expectations. Many young people no longer questioned whether women could become doctors, lawyers, scientists, or business leaders. Those possibilities were now visible all around them. What had once seemed extraordinary gradually became ordinary. Yet history has a way of reminding us how recent these transformations truly were. Many women who lived through the 1960s could still remember a time when opportunities were limited, not by talent or determination, but simply by gender. Their memories served as a reminder that progress should never be taken for granted. Rights and freedoms often exist because previous generations worked hard to secure them. The story of women in 1960s. America is ultimately a story about possibility. It is about people looking at the world around them and deciding that it could be better. It is about questioning assumptions that had existed for decades and imagining new paths forward. Some victories were large, others were small, but together they changed the lives of millions. As we quietly close this chapter for now, imagine the countless women whose names never appeared in history books. They may not have been famous politicians or activists. They were students, mothers, workers, neighbours, and friends. Yet through their everyday choices and persistence, they helped shape the modern world. Their experiences remind us that history is often made not only by great leaders, but also by ordinary people who refuse to stop believing that change is possible. Looking at this history from a distance, it becomes clear that the women of the 1960s were living through a turning point that few fully understood at the time. Most were not trying to become historical figures. They were simply trying to build better lives for themselves and their families. Yet their decisions, questions, and determination helped reshape an entire nation. History often works this way. Great changes begin with ordinary people facing ordinary problems. Imagine a young woman graduating from college in 1961. She may have excellent grades, strong ambitions, and a desire to contribute to society. Yet she enters a world where many employers openly prefer hiring men. She may be told that her education is valuable only until she marries. Friends, relatives, and even strangers might assume that her ultimate goal should be finding a husband rather than building a career. These expectations are so common that many people barely notice them. Now, imagine another young woman graduating 10 or 15 years later. The challenges have not disappeared, but the landscape has changed. New opportunities exist. More women are entering professions that once seemed inaccessible. Employers are beginning to face pressure to treat workers more fairly. Universities are opening doors that had previously been closed. The future still contains obstacles, but it also contains possibilities that were difficult to imagine only a short time earlier. One reason this story remains important is that it reminds us how quickly society can change. In historical terms, a decade is a very short period of time. Yet during the 1960s and 1970s, attitudes that had existed for generations began shifting at remarkable speed. Ideas that once seemed unquestionable became subjects of public debate. Practices that had been accepted for years were suddenly challenged. The process was sometimes messy and controversial, but it demonstrated that social norms are not permanent. The movement also revealed the importance of persistence. Progress did not occur because a single person delivered a speech or because one law was passed. It happened because millions of people continued pushing for change even when success seemed uncertain. Some victories were celebrated immediately. Others took years to become visible. But each effort contributed to a larger transformation. As evening settles over our journey through this chapter of American history, we can see that the story is about more than restrictions and rights. It is about human resilience. It is about people refusing to accept limitations placed upon them, simply because that is how things have always been. And perhaps most importantly, it is about the power of ordinary individuals to influence the future. The women who challenged the expectations of the 1960s may never have known exactly how much they would change the world, but their legacy continues to shape the lives of generations that followed. The legacy of these women can still be seen today, even in ways that many people rarely notice. Every time a woman opens a bank account in her own name, applies for a loan, starts a business, earns a university degree, or pursues a profession that was once closed to her, she is benefiting from changes that were fought for decades earlier. What feels normal now was once the subject of intense debate. History often hides its greatest victories in everyday routines. Of course, the women of the 1960s did not all share the same experiences. America was a vast country with different regions, cultures, and communities. A woman living in a large city might encounter opportunities that were unavailable in a small town. Economic background, education, and family circumstances also shaped individual lives. Yet, despite these differences, many women recognized a common desire for greater freedom over their own futures. The movement's success also depended on courage. Speaking against accepted norms was not always easy. Some women faced criticism from co-workers, relatives, or neighbours. Others worried that demanding equality might damage their careers or personal relationships. Choosing to challenge long-standing traditions often required standing apart from the crowd. Yet many decided that remaining silent would only guarantee that nothing changed. One of the most interesting lessons from this era is how rapidly attitudes can evolve once people begin discussing issues openly. For years, many women believed their frustrations were personal problems. Then they discovered that millions of others felt the same way. What seemed like individual struggles turned out to be shared experiences. This realization transformed private concerns into a public movement capable of influencing national policy and culture. As historians examine this period, they often emphasize that social progress is rarely perfect or complete. Every generation inherits unfinished work from those who came before. The women who fought for equality in the 1960s achieved remarkable victories, but they also left future generations with new challenges to address. That is the nature of history. Each era solves some problems while revealing others. Still, when comparing the world of 1960 with the world that emerged in the decades afterward, the scale of change is impossible to ignore. Opportunities expanded, expectations shifted, laws evolved. Most importantly, millions of women gained greater control over the direction of their own lives. Their achievements reshaped families, workplaces, schools, and communities across the nation. And as our gentle journey through this chapter continues, we are reminded that history is not only a record of governments, wars, and famous leaders. IT is also Saduta story of ordinary people whose everyday decisions gradually transform society. The women of the 1960s may not have known exactly what the future would look like, but through persistence and determination, they helped create a future far different from the one they inherited. Perhaps the most peaceful way to understand this story is to remember that history is often less about dramatic moments and more about gradual change. The women of the 1960s did not wake up one morning and find a completely different world waiting for them. Change arrived slowly, sometimes so slowly that it was difficult to notice. One new law was passed. One barrier was removed. One opportunity became available. Then another followed. Over time, these small steps combined into something much larger. For many families, the changes were deeply personal. A daughter might attend a university her mother never had the chance to enter. A woman might receive a promotion that would have been impossible a generation earlier. A family might encourage its girls to dream as boldly as its boys. These moments rarely appeared in newspapers. Yet they represented the true impact of social progress. At the same time, the history of this period reminds us that every generation lives within the assumptions of its own era. People in the early 1960s often accepted rules that later generations would find surprising or unfair. They were not necessarily cruel people. Many simply grew up believing that society should operate in a certain way because that was all they had ever known. Understanding this helps us view history with patience rather than judgment. As decades passed, many women who experienced these changes firsthand became witnesses to a remarkable transformation. They could compare to very different Americas within a single lifetime. They remembered the restrictions of the past and observed the opportunities of the present. Their stories became valuable reminders of how much society had evolved. The movement for women's equality also demonstrated that progress is rarely achieved by a handful of famous individuals alone, while historians often remember leaders and activists. Lasting change usually depends on millions of ordinary people making countless everyday choices, teachers encouraging students, parents supporting their children, employees challenging unfair treatment, citizens speaking up when they believe something is wrong. Together, these actions create momentum that can alter the course of history. As our quiet exploration continues toward its conclusion, we can see that the story of women in 1960s America is ultimately a story of possibility. It is the story of people expanding the boundaries of what society believed was possible. It is the story of individuals who imagined a future different from the present and worked step by step to make that future real. Their efforts did not change everything overnight, but they changed enough to leave a lasting mark on the generations that followed. When historians study the women of the 1960s, they often focus on laws, protests, and political movements. Those events were certainly important, but there is another side of the story that is quieter and perhaps even more meaningful. It is the story of everyday life. It is the story of women who woke up each morning, prepared breakfast, went to work, attended school, cared for children, balanced household budgets, and tried to build good lives for their families. Most never expected to become part of a historical transformation. Yet they became part of one anyway. A woman working in an office during the early 1960s might have spent years watching male co-workers advance more quickly than she did. She might have accepted this reality because everyone around her insisted it was normal. Then, gradually, she would begin hearing different ideas. Friends discussed equality. Newspapers reported changing laws. New opportunities appeared. For the first time, she might start wondering whether the limitations she faced were truly fair. That simple question had enormous power. Across the country, similar questions were being asked by millions of women. Some voiced their concerns publicly. Others reflected quietly in their homes. Yet together they created a shift in national thinking. The change was not only legal or political, it was psychological. Women increasingly saw themselves as people, capable of choosing their own paths, rather than simply accepting roles assigned by society. The effects spread far beyond the women directly involved. Young boys grew up seeing mothers, sisters, teachers, and co-workers in new ways. Employers learned to recognize talent where they had previously overlooked it. Schools expanded opportunities. Entire communities adapted to changing expectations. A transformation that began with individual experiences gradually reshaped the broader culture. One reason this story remains fascinating is because it demonstrates how difficult it can be to predict the future. If someone had stood in 1960 and accurately described American society several decades later, many people would have found the prediction unbelievable. Yet history is full of such surprises, social changes that seem impossible at one moment can become ordinary reality in another. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is that progress often requires patience. The women who sought greater equality rarely saw every goal achieved immediately. Many victories took years or even decades to fully materialize. Yet each generation built upon the efforts of the previous one. Small advances accumulated over time, creating results that were far greater than any single action could have produced. And so, as we continue drifting gently through this chapter of history, we find ourselves reflecting not only on what changed, but on how change occurs. It begins with questions. It grows through persistence. It spreads through conversations, decisions, and everyday acts of courage. The women of the 1960s proved that even deeply rooted traditions can evolve. And in doing so, they helped shape our future that offered far more possibilities than the world they inherited. As the century moved forward, the impact of these changes became impossible to ignore. Women were no longer limited to a narrow set of expectations. They appeared in professions, institutions, and leadership roles that had once been dominated almost entirely by men. For younger generations, this increasingly felt normal. Yet the women who had lived through the earlier decades understood just how extraordinary the transformation had been. Many of them remembered a time when society often spoke about women's futures as if they had already been decided. Expectations were established early, and questioning them could bring criticism or resistance. By contrast, later generations grew up with a wider range of possibilities. They could imagine careers, education, travel, business ownership, public service, or countless other paths. The ability to choose became one of the most important. Comes officer. Changes that began during the 1960 Sekunde. History also teaches us that social change rarely belongs to a single group of people. While courageous women played the central role in this story, many allies supported the movement as well. Family members, teachers, co-workers, community leaders, and others helped create environments where new opportunities could emerge. Progress often occurs when individuals from different backgrounds work together toward a common goal. At the same time, the story reminds us that no generation is perfect. Every era has assumptions that later generations may question, just as people in the 1960s challenged traditions they inherited. Future generations would continue, examining the values and systems of their own time. This process of reflection and improvement is part of how societies grow and adapt. For those studying history today, the experiences of women in 1960s America provide a valuable lesson in persistence. Many obstacles appeared overwhelming at first. Change seemed slow. Success was never guaranteed. Yet steady effort over many years produced results that transformed millions of lives. The achievements were not the result of a single dramatic moment, but of countless actions taken by ordinary people who believed a better future was possible. As our journey through this era continues, the noise of political debates and public controversies gradually fades into the background. What remains is a simple human story. It is the story of individuals seeking dignity, opportunity, and the freedom to shape their own lives. Their efforts left a lasting mark on American society and demonstrated that, even long established, customs can change when people are willing to imagine something better and work patiently to achieve it. Perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of this story is how ordinary it seemed while it was happening. Most people living through their 1960 Sekunde were not thinking about how future historians would describe their era. They were focused on daily responsibilities. They went to work, attended classes, cared for family members, paid bills, and made plans for the future. Yet, beneath these ordinary routines, society was slowly changing in ways that would affect generations to come. A young woman entering adulthood during this period often found herself standing between two worlds. One world was shaped by traditions that had existed for decades. It encouraged her to follow familiar expectations and avoid questioning established roles. The other world was beginning to offer new possibilities. It suggested that her future could be determined by her talents, interests, and ambitions rather than by assumptions about what women should or should not do. Navigating between these two worlds was not always easy. Many women experienced moments of uncertainty, pursuing opportunities that had traditionally been reserved for men sometimes, meant facing criticism or doubt. Some worried about disappointing family members. Others feared failure in environments where they were often judged more harshly than their male counterparts. Yet despite these concerns, countless women continued moving forward. Their willingness to take risks helped open doors for those who followed. The transformation also changed how success was defined. In earlier decades, society often presented a very narrow image of what a successful woman should be. By the end of the 20th century, that image had become much broader. Success could mean raising a family, building a career, serving a community, pursuing education, starting a business, or combining several of these goals. Increasingly, the emphasis shifted toward personal choice. This idea of choice may seem simple, but it represented a profound shift in thinking. Instead of expecting all women to follow the same path, society gradually became more accepting of different life experiences and ambitions. While disagreements and challenges remained, the range of acceptable possibilities expanded dramatically. As we reflect on the women of the 1960s, it becomes clear that their story is not only about rights or laws. It is also about courage in everyday life. It is about individuals who questioned assumptions, pursued opportunities, and imagined a future that looked different from the present. Many never considered themselves pioneers, yet their decisions contributed to changes that reached far beyond their own lives. And so this chapter of history continues to offer an important lesson. Lasting change often begins quietly. It starts with people asking questions, sharing experiences, and refusing to accept unnecessary limitations. Over time, those small actions accumulate into something much larger. The women of the 1960s demonstrated that even when progress seems slow, persistence can reshape society and create possibilities that once appeared out of reach. Looking back across the decades, it is easy to focus on the victories and forget how uncertain the future once seemed. For the women living through the 1960s, there was no guarantee that society would change. Many of the barriers they faced had existed for generations. Employers, schools, financial institutions, and even cultural traditions often reinforced the idea that men and women should occupy different places in society. Challenging those beliefs required patience and determination because the obstacles were deeply rooted. What makes this period so fascinating is that change occurred both publicly and privately. Publicly, laws were debated, organisations were formed, and national conversations took place. Privately, millions of women were making decisions that gradually reshaped the culture. A woman deciding to continue her education, apply for a promotion, start a business, or pursue a career in a male-dominated field was participating in a larger transformation, even if she never considered herself part of a movement. Many of these women encountered setbacks along the way. Success was rarely immediate. Some applications were rejected. Some promotions never arrived. Some ambitions were delayed for years. Yet persistence proved powerful. Every woman who entered a new profession or challenged an old assumption helped make it easier for others to do the same. Progress often moved forward one person at a time. The story also reminds us that social expectations can be surprisingly fragile. Rules that seem permanent may change far more quickly than anyone expects. In the early 1960s, many Americans accepted certain gender roles as simple facts of life. By the end of the century, many of those same assumptions had been questioned, revised, or abandoned. What had once appeared fixed turned out to be temporary. For future generations, these changes created opportunities that previous generations could barely imagine. Young women grew up with a wider view of what their lives might become. They could see examples of female leaders, professionals, entrepreneurs, scientists, and public figures. The world was still imperfect, but the boundaries had expanded dramatically. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. History is not only shaped by famous events, it is also shaped by ordinary people who quietly decide that existing limitations are no longer acceptable. Their efforts may seem small at the time, but over the years they accumulate into lasting change. As our calm journey through this chapter continues, the women of the 1960s stand as a reminder that progress often begins with simple questions. Why should things remain this way? Could life be different? Could opportunities be shared more fairly? Those questions echoed across a generation and helped transform American society, leaving a legacy that continues to influence the lives of millions even today. As the years continued to pass, the story of women in 1960s America became more than a discussion about rights and opportunities. It became a lesson about how societies evolve. Every generation inherits a world shaped by the choices of those who came before. Sometimes those inherited traditions provide stability and comfort. Other times they create limits that people eventually decide to challenge. The women of the 1960s found themselves living at one of those moments when old assumptions were being reconsidered. What is especially interesting is that many changes occurred so gradually that people barely noticed them at first. A company hired a woman for a position that had traditionally gone to a man. A university accepted more female students into competitive programs. A family encouraged a daughter to pursue a career. That would have seemed unusual a decade earlier. Each individual event appeared small, yet together they formed a much larger transformation. The women who lived through this era often had different goals and different experiences. Some wanted professional careers. Others focused on education. Many simply wanted the freedom to make their own choices without being restricted by expectations based solely on gender. Despite these differences, they shared a belief that opportunity should be determined by ability rather than assumptions. As new possibilities emerged, young girls began growing up with a broader vision of the future. They could look around and see examples of women succeeding in areas that had once been difficult to enter. These examples mattered because they changed what seemed possible. Human beings often shape their ambitions according to what they believe can be achieved. When new paths become visible, new dreams begin to form. Historians sometimes describe this process as a change in expectations. Before laws can change, people often need to imagine a different future. Before institutions can evolve, individuals must believe that improvement is possible. The women of the 1960s helped create that sense of possibility. They demonstrated that long-standing customs were not necessarily permanent and that societies could adapt to new ideas. Of course, no historical change is ever completely finished. Every generation faces new challenges and new debates. Yet the achievements of this period provided a foundation upon which future generations could build. The progress made during those years expanded opportunities for millions of people who would never personally meet the women responsible for creating that change. As we continue drifting through this quiet chapter of history, we are reminded that the most influential people are not always the most famous. Often they are ordinary individuals who choose persistence over resignation. They continue moving forward even when change seems slow. The women of the 1960s did exactly that. And through their efforts, they helped create a society that offered more choices, more opportunities, and a broader vision of what the future could hold. The longer we examine this period, the more we realize that its significance extends beyond the lives of the women who experienced it directly. The changes that began in the 1960s influenced future generations in ways that were often impossible to predict. A girl born in the 1970s would grow up in a world different from the one her mother had known. A girl born in the 1990s would inherit even more opportunities. Each generation benefited from the efforts of those who came before, creating a chain of progress stretching across decades. One of the most powerful aspects of this story is that it demonstrates how history is built gradually. Popular culture often focuses on dramatic moments, famous speeches, and major events. Yet many of the most important transformations happen quietly. They occur in classrooms where students are encouraged to aim higher. They occur in workplaces where opportunities become more accessible. They occur in families where parents teach their children to believe in their abilities, rather than accept limitations imposed by others. For many women of the 1960s, the goal was never to become famous. Most simply wanted fairness. They wanted their efforts to be judged by the quality of their work rather than by assumptions about gender. They wanted the freedom to pursue ambitions, support their families, and make decisions about their own futures. These desires were not radical. They were deeply human. As society changed, many institutions changed alongside it. Businesses discovered that expanding opportunities could benefit everyone. Universities welcomed a wider range of talented students. Communities gained new leaders and perspectives. The country itself became stronger when more people were able to contribute their skills and ideas. While disagreements remained, the advantages of broader participation became increasingly clear. The story also reveals something important about courage. Courage is not always dramatic. It is not always found in grand public gestures. Sometimes courage means applying for a position that others say you cannot have. Sometimes it means continuing your education despite discouragement. Sometimes it means believing in your own potential when the world seems uncertain. Thousands of women displayed this kind of quiet courage every day, and their collective efforts produced lasting results. Looking back now, it is clear that the women of the 1960 Sekunde helped open doors that had long been closed. Some of those doors opened slowly. Others required years of effort before they finally moved. Yet once opened, they changed the landscape for generations to come. And so, as our gentle historical journey moves forward, we are left with a simple observation. The future is rarely shaped by a single moment. It is shaped by countless individuals making choices, asking questions, and refusing to believe that the world must always remain exactly as it is. The women of the 1960s understood that lesson well, and their determination helped create a future far broader than many people thought possible. As we move further away from the events of the 1960s, it becomes easier to see the full picture. At diese Time, many people viewed the changes as temporary debates or political disagreements. Few realized they were witnessing a transformation that would influence American society for generations. History often feels ordinary while it is happening. Only later do people recognize how important certain moments truly were. The women who lived through this era left behind more than legal victories. They left behind examples. Their daughters and granddaughters grew up seeing women accomplish things that earlier generations had rarely been allowed to attempt. Every successful doctor, lawyer, teacher, scientist, entrepreneur, or public official helped reinforce a simple but powerful idea. Talent and determination are not limited by gender. At the same time, this history reminds us that progress is rarely automatic. Every improvement required effort from people who were willing to challenge familiar assumptions. Change happened because individuals spoke up, supported one another, and continued pushing forward even when success seemed distant. Without that persistence, many opportunities that later generations take for granted might never have existed. Another important lesson from this story is that societies are constantly evolving. The values and expectations of one era are not necessarily the values and expectations of the next. What seems completely normal today may appear surprising to future generations, just as many of the restrictions faced by women in the 1960s seem surprising to us now. History encourages humility because it reminds us that every generation is shaped by beliefs that may eventually change. For the women who experienced these decades firsthand, the transformation was deeply personal. They watched opportunities expand, barriers fall, attitudes. Some saw dreams become possible that once seemed unreachable. Others simply enjoyed the freedom to make choices that previous generations had been denied. Their lives became living evidence that social change can have real consequences for ordinary people. As evening settles over this chapter of our story, we can reflect on how much began with a simple desire for fairness. Most of the women involved were not seeking special treatment. They wanted the chance to learn, work, succeed, and shape their own futures according to their abilities and ambitions. That desire resonated with millions of people and gradually reshaped the nation. And perhaps that is the quiet message left behind by the women of 1960s. America. History is not only written by presidents, generals, or famous leaders. It is also written by ordinary people who decide that the future can be better than the present. Through patience, determination, and countless everyday actions, they helped create a world filled with opportunities that once seemed impossible. There is also something deeply human about the way these changes unfolded. Most women were not trying to change the entire country. They were trying to solve problems in their own lives. A student wanted access to better educational opportunities. A worker wanted fair pay for fair work. A mother wanted her daughter to have more choices than she had been given. These goals were personal, yet when millions of people shared similar hopes, their combined efforts created a movement that reached far beyond individual lives. The transformation of the 1960s also teaches us that history is often shaped by patience. Many victories did not arrive immediately. Some women spent years facing rejection before seeing progress. Others worked toward goals they knew might not be fully realized until the next generation. Yet they continued moving forward because they believed that even small improvements could make a difference. As opportunities expanded, society gradually benefited from talents that had previously been overlooked. Businesses gained skilled employees. Universities welcomed brilliant students. Communities gained leaders with fresh perspectives. The nation itself became stronger when more people were able to contribute their abilities without unnecessary barriers standing in the way. Another fascinating aspect of this story is how quickly new realities can become normal. Once opportunities became more widely available, younger generations often accepted them as a natural part of life. Many found it difficult to imagine a time when women faced so many restrictions in education, employment, and financial independence. This is one of history's most interesting patterns. Major changes can seem revolutionary at first, but eventually they become ordinary. Yet remembering the past remains important. Understanding what life was like for women in the 1960 Sekunde helps us appreciate how much society evolved in a relatively short period of time. It reminds us that progress is not inevitable. It requires effort, persistence, and people willing to imagine a better future. For historians, the era stands as a powerful example of how social attitudes can change. Ideas that once appeared fixed proved capable of evolving. Institutions adapted. Laws changed. Expectations shifted. Most importantly, millions of individuals gained greater freedom to decide the direction of their own lives. As our quiet journey through this chapter continues, we can see that the story is ultimately one of hope. It shows that societies are capable of growth and improvement, It demonstrates that ordinary people can influence the future in meaningful ways. And it reminds us that even when change feels slow, steady determination can reshape the world over time. The women of the 1960s may not have known exactly what the future would look like, but through their actions they helped create a future filled with possibilities that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. By the end of the 20th century, many of the questions first raised during the 1960s had become part of a much larger conversation about equality, opportunity, and individual freedom. The world was far from perfect, but it was undeniably different. Women who had once been expected to follow a narrow path now had access to a wider range of choices. They could pursue careers, education, public service, entrepreneurship, or countless other ambitions. Most importantly, they increasingly had the ability to decide for themselves. For many of the women who had lived through the earlier decades, these changes were deeply meaningful. They remembered classrooms where girls were encouraged to dream smaller than boys. They remembered workplaces where promotions seemed permanently out of reach. They remembered assumptions that limited possibilities before a person even had the chance to prove themselves. Watching those assumptions weaken over time felt like witnessing history unfold in real life. One reason this story continues to resonate is because it highlights the relationship between individual actions and larger social change. It is easy to assume that history is shaped only by powerful leaders or major institutions. Yet the experiences of women in the 1960s reveal a different truth. Large transformations often begin with countless small decisions made by ordinary people. A student chooses not to give up on her education. An employee applies for a position others say she cannot have. A parent encourages a child to pursue ambitious goals. These actions may seem minor on their own, but together they can alter the direction of society. The story also reminds us that progress is rarely immediate. There were setbacks, disagreements, and moments of frustration. Some changes took years to achieve. Others required decades. Yet persistence proved stronger than resistance. Over time, ideas that once seemed controversial became widely accepted. Opportunities that were once rare became increasingly common. The boundaries of possibility continued expanding. Perhaps that is why this period remains so fascinating to historians. It demonstrates how quickly the world can change. When people begin questioning assumptions that have existed for generations, the women of the 1960s did not simply challenge specific rules. They challenged the belief that those rules were permanent. In doing so, they opened the door to new ways of thinking about fairness, opportunity, and human potential. As our calm exploration of this era continues, we are reminded that history is ultimately a story about people. It is about hopes, ambitions, disappointments, and perseverance. It is about individuals who look at the world around them and imagine something better. The women of the 1960s did exactly that, and their efforts helped create a future in which millions of others could pursue lives filled with greater freedom, choice, and possibility. And perhaps that is the most comforting lesson we can take from this story. History is not frozen in place. The world that seems permanent today may look very different tomorrow. The women of the 1960s proved that change is possible even when obstacles appear overwhelming. They demonstrated that determination, patience, and courage can gradually reshape society in ways that once seemed unimaginable. Many of them never became famous. Their names were never printed in textbooks. Yet their influence lived on through the opportunities they helped create. Every young woman who pursued an education, started a career, opened a business, or followed her ambitions benefited in some way from the doors that previous generations had worked so hard to unlock. As we quietly reflect on this chapter of American history, it becomes clear that the story is not simply about restrictions or rights. It is about human potential. It is about people believing that their future should not be limited by expectations inherited from the past. It is about ordinary individuals who refused to accept that things must always remain the same. The women of the 1960s faced challenges that now seem distant, yet their experiences continue to offer valuable lessons. They remind us that progress often begins with simple questions, grows through persistence, and succeeds because ordinary people are willing to keep moving forward even when the path is difficult. And so, as the lights dim on this part of our journey through the past, we are left with a quiet appreciation for those who helped shape a more open future. Their story is a reminder that history is not only about what happened long ago. It is also about the choices people make, the possibilities they create, and the legacy they leave behind for generations yet to come. Looking across the entire story, one thing becomes very clear. The changes experienced by women in America during the 1960s were not the result of a single event or single law or single leader. They were the result of countless individuals deciding that the future did not have to look exactly like the past. Each person contributed in their own way. Some spoke publicly, others worked quietly, some challenged unfair policies directly, while others simply refused to abandon their ambitions. Together, their efforts created momentum that gradually transformed society. For modern audiences, it can be surprising to learn how recently many of these changes occurred. The 1960s are not ancient history. Many people who lived through that decade are still alive today, sharing memories of a world that was very different from the one younger generations know. Their experiences remind us that history is often much closer than we imagine. The story also encourages us to think about the meaning of opportunity. Opportunity is more than the absence of restrictions. It is the ability to pursue goals, develop talents, and make meaningful choices about one's own future. For many women, gaining greater access to education, employment, and financial independence represented far more than practical advantages. It represented recognition of their abilities and potential. As society evolved, millions of women discovered possibilities that earlier generations had been told were unrealistic. Some became leaders in their professions. Others made contributions to science, medicine, education, business, and public service. Many simply lived lives with more freedom than their mothers or grandmothers had known. Of these outcomes reflected the gradual expansion of opportunity that began during the transformative years of the 1960s. History often teaches that progress arrives through persistence rather than speed. The women who pushed for change rarely saw immediate results. Many faced disappointment, criticism, and resistance. Yet they continued because they believed that future generations deserved a wider range of choices. Their patience ultimately helped create lasting change. As our gentle journey through this era continues toward its final chapters, we can appreciate the courage required to challenge long-standing assumptions. It is never easy to question traditions that have existed for decades. Yet, throughout history, meaningful progress has often depended on people willing to ask difficult questions and imagine new possibilities. The women of 1960s America did exactly that. Through determination, resilience, and hope, they helped reshape expectations about what women could achieve and how society could function. Their story remains one of the most important examples of how ordinary individuals can influence the future, proving that even gradual change can leave an extraordinary legacy that continues to shape lives many decades later. Even today, when we look around at modern workplaces, universities, and communities, we can still see the echoes of the changes that began during the 1960s, the freedoms and opportunities that many people consider ordinary did not appear by accident. They emerged because previous generations questioned old assumptions and worked steadily toward something better. History often hides these efforts beneath the surface of everyday life, but their impact remains everywhere. Consider how different the world appeared at the beginning of the decade. Many women were expected to fit into carefully defined roles. Their ambitions were often limited by social expectations long before they had the chance to discover what they were capable of achieving. By the end of the century, however, the range of possibilities had expanded dramatically. Women could be found leading companies, teaching at universities, conducting scientific research, serving in government, and contributing to nearly every area of public life. What makes this transformation remarkable is that it was achieved through countless individual stories rather than one single dramatic event. A student refusing to abandon her education, a worker demanding fair treatment, a mother encouraging her daughter to dream bigger than society expected, a woman applying for a position despite being told she did not belong. These actions may have seemed small at the time, yet together they helped create a powerful movement that changed the course of history. The story also reminds us that progress is rarely perfect. Every generation faces challenges that remain unresolved. The women of the 1960s understood this reality. They knew they might not witness every goal achieved during their lifetimes. Yet they continued moving forward because they believed that even partial progress could improve the future for those who came after them. That long-term perspective became one of the movement's greatest strengths. This is why the history of women in 1960 Sekunde America continues to inspire interest decades later. It is not simply a story about laws or politics. It is a story about perseverance. It is a story about people refusing to let their future be defined entirely by the past. It demonstrates how ordinary individuals can influence society through determination, patience, and a willingness to challenge outdated ideas. As we near the end of this chapter, imagine once more the millions of women whose names never appeared in history books. Most lived ordinary lives. They worked, studied, cared for families, and pursued personal goals. Yet through their choices, they contributed to changes that would affect generations they would never meet. Their legacy exists not in monuments or grand celebrations, but in the opportunities available to countless people today. And so, the story of women in 1960s America becomes more than a historical account. It becomes a reminder that meaningful change often begins quietly. It grows through persistence, spreads through communities, and eventually reshapes the world in ways that once seemed impossible. The women of that era may not have known exactly what the future would look like, but their courage helped create a future filled with far more freedom, possibility, and choice than the one they inherited. As the decades passed, the accomplishments of these women became woven into the fabric of everyday life. What once required courage and determination gradually became accepted as normal. Young women entering adulthood often had opportunities that their grandmothers could scarcely imagine. They could choose different educational paths, pursue a variety of careers, and make decisions about their futures with far greater independence than previous generations. These freedoms were not created overnight. They were built step by step through years of effort by countless individuals. One of the most important lessons from this period is that social change is often invisible while it is happening. People rarely wake up one morning and realize they are living through a historic transformation. Instead, change arrives slowly. Attitudes shift. Expectations evolve. Institutions adapt. Looking back years later, people suddenly realize how much has changed. The women of the 1960s also demonstrated the importance of believing in possibilities that do not yet exist. Many pursued goals that seemed unrealistic at the time. They applied for positions others thought they could never obtain. They entered classrooms where few women had studied before. They imagined futures that challenged traditional expectations. Their willingness to imagine something different helped create opportunities that later generations would inherit. At the heart of this story is a simple idea. Human potential should not be limited by assumptions about who a person is supposed to be. Every individual deserves the chance to develop talents, pursue ambitions, and contribute to society in meaningful ways. The women who challenged restrictions during the 1960s were ultimately fighting for that principle. They believed that ability mattered more than outdated stereotypes, and history gradually proved them right. For historians, this era remains a powerful example of how ordinary people can influence the course of events. Many participants were not famous. They did not expect their actions to be remembered. Yet their choices helped transform workplaces, schools, communities, and families across the nation. Their influence extended far beyond their own lifetimes. As our quiet journey continues, we are reminded that every generation inherits both the achievements and responsibilities of those who came before. The progress made during the 1960s was not the end of history, but part of an ongoing story. new challenges would emerge, and future generations would continue seeking ways to build a fairer society. Still, the legacy of the women who lived through that remarkable decade remains clear. Through persistence, courage, and hope, they expanded the boundaries of possibility. They showed that traditions can evolve, opportunities can grow, and societies can change. Their story stands as a reminder that even the most ordinary people can leave an extraordinary mark on the future when they refuse to stop believing that a better world is possible. Perhaps the most lasting part of this story is not the laws that were passed or the institutions that changed, but the confidence that future generations gained because of those changes. Once opportunities began opening, countless women discovered abilities and ambitions that might otherwise have remained hidden. Society benefited from their talents, creativity, and determination. The result was a nation that could draw upon a wider range of ideas and perspectives than ever before. Many of the women who experienced the 1960s never saw themselves as historical figures. They simply wanted fair opportunities and the freedom to make choices about their own lives. Yet history is often shaped by people exactly like them. The most important transformations frequently begin with ordinary individuals who decide that existing conditions are not good enough and that improvement is possible. As the years passed, the conversations that started in the 1960s influenced future debates about equality and opportunity. The decade became a reference point for later generations seeking change in other areas of society. It showed that long-standing traditions could be questioned and that progress could occur even when resistance seemed strong. Back. It is remarkable how much changed within a relatively short period of time. Expectations that had existed for decades were challenged. Opportunities expanded. New paths became available. Most importantly, millions of women gained greater control over the direction of their own futures. Their achievements did not erase every obstacle, but they created a foundation upon which future generations could continue building. As our calm exploration of this chapter draws closer to its conclusion, we can appreciate the simple truth at the heart of the story. The women of the 1960s were not asking for extraordinary privileges. They were asking for the chance to be judged by their abilities, pursue their goals, and make meaningful choices about their lives. Through patience, persistence, and courage, they helped move society toward that ideal. Their legacy remains visible, not only in laws and institutions, but in everyday life itself. It can be seen in classrooms, workplaces, businesses, and communities across the country. And it serves as a reminder that history is often changed by ordinary people who quietly believe that tomorrow can be better than today and who are willing to work toward that future one step at a time. And as we bring this long and thoughtful journey to a gentle close, the story of women in 1960s America leaves us with more than a collection of historical facts. It leaves us with a reminder of how powerful ordinary people can be when they believe that change is possible. The women who lived during that era were not superheroes, celebrities, or figures from distant legends. They were students studying late into the night. mothers caring for their families, workers arriving at their jobs every morning, and dreamers imagining a future that looked different from the world around them. Many of them faced obstacles that seemed permanent. They encountered rules, expectations, and traditions that had existed for generations. Yet, instead of accepting every limitation placed before them, they asked questions. They imagined alternatives. They pushed forward one step at a time, even when progress seemed slow. Their determination gradually changed schools, workplaces, communities, and the nation itself. History often focuses on dramatic events, but the true story of this era is found in thousands of quiet moments. A woman deciding to continue her education, a daughter encouraged to pursue her ambitions, a worker applying for a position once considered impossible, a family choosing to believe in opportunity rather than tradition alone. These moments may have seemed small at the time, yet together they created a transformation that reached far into the future. Today, many of the freedoms and opportunities that people enjoy can be traced back to those years of persistence and hope. The women of the 1960s helped expand the boundaries of what was possible. They showed that society could evolve, that assumptions could be challenged, and that the future did not have to be limited by the past. Perhaps that is the most comforting lesson of all. History is never completely finished. Every generation inherits a world shaped by those who came before. But every generation also has the power to shape what comes next. The women of the 1960s understood this truth, even if they did not always realize the full impact of their actions. Through courage, patience, and determination, they left behind a legacy that continues to influence millions of lives. And now, as the evening grows quiet and this chapter of history gently fades into the distance, we can remember them not only for the changes they achieved, but for the hope they carried. Their story reminds us that progress often begins with ordinary people who dare to imagine a better tomorrow. It grows through persistence, survives through courage, and ultimately becomes part of the world future generations inherit. With that peaceful thought, we close the book on this chapter of the past, grateful for the lessons it offers and the remarkable individuals who helped write it. Good night, and until our next journey through history, sleep well.